So very good afternoon. Business communication. The majorly the business communication is divided into nearly around 16 units. So in this first unit, we are going to learn something about what is the introduction and what are the different objectives of business communication. Then we'll learn something about business communication and their meaning. What is the communication process, which involves generally, let us say, if two or three people are interacting, then what type of communication process one has to follow. We also learn something about barriers to the communication in this unit. We learn something about classification of communication and importance of communication in the workplace. So these are the major contents which are going to be covered in the unit number 1. So let's start with the introduction. If you see, the communication is considered to be one of the most important component for the success of our personal as well as professional lives. If you see this image, the communication is everywhere. Whether you interact with the family members, whether you interact professionally in the organizations, wherever you are going, the communication plays a very vital role. It helps in building relationships both in personal as well as in the professional lives. There are various modes of communication. These various modes are as follows: formal, informal, oral, written, verbal, and non-verbal communication. Let's see these modes of communication in detail. So let's start with first oral forms of communication. These are the major forms which takes place everywhere. It generally includes something like a face-to-face conversations where a group of people communicate among each other. It also includes something like a telephonic conversations. It includes meetings professionally, seminars, conferences, dictation, presentation, group discussion, interviews, and video conferences. So these are various forms of oral communication which you generally used to take care when you communicate. The written forms include something like memos, which are internal part of a communication within the organization. It also includes something like business letter writing, email writing, faxes, notices, circulars, newsletters, reports, proposals, research papers, bulletin, brochures, manuals, and in-house journals. All these forms are mostly either written in a language and they are more language oriented. So you have to follow a specific set of patterns when you deal with something like a written communication. The another mode of communication is something like formal communication. If you see, it is something like a verbal presentation or a document which intend to share something information. And this formal communication generally follows a specific rules or something like a professional rules to communicate. Without these rules, you cannot able to bypass the communication. And this formal communication generally avoids the slang terminology. Another form of communication is informal. The another name of informal communication is also known as something like a grapevine communication. And it is very casual form of, you can say, the information sharing among the people. Whenever you communicate among the friends or family members, you generally have a casual approach. And within the business environment, these conversations happens either through electronic mails, text messages, or phone calls between the socializing of employees. Verbal communication. The verbal communication is the share of information between the individuals using speech. It includes something like individuals working within the business. They need to use verbal communication that employs readily understanding spoken words, stress, tone of voice with which the words are expressed is appropriate. And the verbal communication is mostly required something like a speaking skills. Non-verbal communication, it includes something like a pitch, speed, voice, volume, gesture, facial expressions, postures, proximity, space, eye movements, and dress and appearance. And remember, If you see that research has suggested that only 5% is produced by using spoken language, and rest 95% is heavily dependent on the verbal, non-verbal communication. And if you see 45% in this non-verbal again, 45% is by tone or inflection, or if you see other 50% is majorly on the body language, movements, and eye contacts. So if you see, the non-verbal plays a very, very important role in the communication aspects. Let's see the meaning, what exactly the communication means. So these are some popular definitions where different, you can say, the authors have given the definitions. According to Newman and Summer, communication is an exchange of facts, ideas, opinions, emotions by two or more persons. So, whatever the ideas, whatever the emotions you are going to share among either professionally or among the group of people, it defines the communication aspects. According to Alien Lewis, it is a sum of all things one person does when he wants to create understanding in the mind of other. So, whatever the feelings you are having in your mind, you just share those feelings with other people, either in the positive or either in the negative direction. So that leads to something like a communication pattern. Billows, Gilson, and Odin define communication as a communication by words, letters, symbols, messages, and as a way that one organization member shares meaning with another. So he mainly emphasized mostly on the organizational communication patterns. So if you see, out of these common examples, out of these three common definitions, the common point of communication is just sharing of one's idea to another. If you share the ideas properly, that means you have completed your communication processes very effectively. So, what are the skills required for communication? So, these are the four major communicative skills: LSWR, that is something like listening, speaking, reading, writing. The listening includes something like when you listen to a specific communication aspects. Let us say a group of three or four people are speaking, so you keenly listen to them, what exactly they are speaking. Speaking includes the most of verbal communication aspects. It is mostly oral in nature, so you require a lot of speaking skills whenever you speak. So it requires something like a good pronunciation. It requires something like a good use of words whenever you speak among the group of people. Reading includes something like, you can say, whenever you write a specific report, if a person has written a report, so you read that review, or you give something like an reviews based on something like a grievance reviews or something. So you read that reviews, what exactly the person has written, and then you give according to the feedback. So the reading skills include that thing. And the writing skills include something like, you say that mostly something like business letter writing or a memo writing or something like a notice writing, circulars. So these are something like a writing skills. And these skills are very, very important whenever you are going to communicate. So these are the four major skills. And out of these four major skills, the most important skill is something like a listening pattern. That means if you listen very properly, you effectively communicate among the group of people. And whatever the receiver is giving you, or whatever the third person is saying, you can able to communicate effectively. So that's why the listening skills are very, very important. The characteristics of communication. So these are major characteristics of communication. So it is generally unavoidable. So the characteristics includes like communication is every time it is very, very unavoidable in nature. You cannot avoid. Even let us say if you are communicating among with a pet or something like a dog or a cat, you use something like a facial gestures or something like an, you can say the different gestures, hand movements to communicate. So it is mostly unavoidable. You cannot avoid communication. It is a two-way exchange of information. So you will be having someone, you are exchanging whatever the information either from yourself to the another person, either personally or professionally. It is a process. So it includes something like a very good processes aspects, which is in detail. We will learn this process later in this upcoming slides. So it is having a complete set of process. It involves sender and a receiver, and it could be verbal and non-verbal. So both these verbal and non-verbal goes in tandem. For example, if you are going to give a presentation, so whenever you are going to give a presentation, you have seen that mostly the verbal aspects goes on. But the moment you use more non-verbal, your communication is very good. So this is considered to be one of the major characteristics. It is very dynamic in process. So dynamic process means it is very spontaneous. For example, you use different gestures. Each gesture is having a different meaning. And let us say, for example, if you are using a spontaneous gestures or something like a cautious gestures, so spontaneous gestures are very dynamic. And depending on the situation, you use these type of gesture aspects. So that's why the communication is most dynamic in nature. And it enables understanding. So if you, whatever the sender is communicating, if the receiver understands perfectly, then your communication set pattern is completed. So these are the major, you can say, the characteristics of communication aspects. Then comes something like communication process. So we'll see in detail about the communication process, what exactly it means. So it is something like you will be having a sender. Then the sender uses a specific channel and he sends a specific message to the channel. For example, there are two people who want to converse themselves and they are very far. Let us say one person is in one of the organization and another person is in another organization. So they want to communicate. So what they do is that first they select the channel, what channel they want, and based on that channel, they send their messages. Once the message is being received, the receiver, he receives that particular message, he decodes that message, and then he provides that message into a response aspect. And finally, you see, he provides you the feedback. So this is complete communication process. And you people will be also having some types of gaps or noises. So these gaps and noises occurs either due to some different barriers, you can say, or due to some different noises. So depending on the situation, these noises and these barriers, they used to change. So the steps of communication process, there are 7 steps. So these 2 steps are broadly being classified into 2 stages. One is at the sender end and another is at the receiver end. In the sender end, it is something like ideation, encoding, and transmission. Ideation means, let us say, I'm giving an example that one person wants to communicate with another one. So what he does is that he checks the idea. Okay, let's grasp the email. Okay, so want to send a message. So what he does is that he takes an email, he frames the email. That means he is having the idea that how you are going to frame an email. Then he encodes the email. He forms a specific structure. And he uses a specific email account, either official or something like a personal account, to transmit that particular data through using the internet. So this happens mostly at the sender end. Now, if at the receiver end, if you see, once the transmitted message is being received by the receiver, he sees that particular receipt. Whatever he has received, he just go through sees, he decodes that message by himself, what exactly that message is. He himself decodes it. Once the decoded message is be there, he replies to that particular email, whether he has in the favor of anything or not. And then he accepts and then he gives a immediate feedback. So these are the major 7 steps, if you see, whenever the communication process effectively. Remember, if there is any internet issue is there, so what happens is that the message will not be delivered to the receiver. So this is something like a noise. That means there can be a technical noise, there can be something like, and you can say the noise which includes mostly like, you can say the human error noise. It can be any type of noises will be there. Okay, so these are the 7 different steps which generally the communication process the people generally used to face. Then comes something like effectiveness communication. So what things the effectiveness of communication happens when it conveys. So if the communication process, what things you will say that if the communication process is effective in nature, how you are going to clarify that thing. The first thing is that what is the clarity of the message that you are to be conveyed. If the clarity is there, that means your communication process is effective in nature. Second one, clarity about the purpose and objective of research. For what purpose you have sent that communication pattern. Let us say if you have sent a particular message, what is the purpose of that message? Whether you are you have achieved that purpose or not. If you are not achieved, that means there are barriers. So you have to understand that exactly the clarity should be there. The objective of the research, it should be there. You should always research first and then send your messages. Then only your communication process will be effective. Common language and background. Common language includes that both the sender and the receiver should be at the same language. If there is some deviation in the language, there will be a problem. Always use appropriate media to communicate and easiest medium to communicate the message. And once the receiver receives the message, you should give the feedback. So these are the major effectiveness of communication. If you lack anything, then the communication process fails. So let's see what are the different noises in detail. So like I've told that every communication process fails because there are set of noises are there or there are some barriers are there. Remember the noise and a barrier is something different. Noise is relates to something like environmental or technological or aspects. But whereas barriers, it is something like if the sender he has done some mistake or a receiver he has done a mistake, then you will be facing a particular barrier aspect. So there are three different types. The first one is something like physical noise, which helps, let us say, if the people are communicating. So it occurs due to distracting sounds, poor aesthetics, or just information overload. So when you listen that particular aspects, so it is mostly the physical noises aspects. So more of distracting noises will come into ears. So the more the distracting noise will come, the more the problem you will face. Then something like a psychological noise. Psychological noise includes something like whenever you hear or there are disabilities about the fatigue or something like a physical disabilities or you convey whenever you speak or listen. That is something related to your physical noise approach. Then comes something about your psychological noises. So psychological noises include something like you can say sometimes the emotions within the sender or the receiver, such as preoccupations, hostility, fear. You don't have interest to listen. You fear whatever I'm communicating, whether I'm communicating good or bad. So these are something like a psychological noises. So these are the different noises which you see generally occur when you are going in the communication aspects. So now let's see the barriers. So the barriers include something like environmental barriers. It includes something like individual barriers. It also includes something like organizational barriers, channel barriers, linguistic and cultural barriers, schematic barriers, and non-verbal barriers. So these are the major classification of the barriers which generally occur whenever you say in the communication patterns. So environmental barriers. So environmental barriers is same as physical noise, but it could be form of distracting sounds or overcrowded room or poor facilities, aesthetics. For let us give an example that let us say if you're giving a presentation in the among the group of people and there is a lot of outside noise is coming up where you are getting distracted every time whenever you say whenever you are dealing with the presentation. So this is something like an environmental barriers. So you are not able to concentrate on the presentation and what exactly the audience are doing. So that leads to something like an environmental barrier aspects. Then comes something like individual barriers. So some these individual barriers are also known as something like intrapersonal communication barriers. And these barriers generally occur due to these various reasons. That is something like wrong assumptions, varied perceptions, differing backgrounds, wrong inferences in previous categories, categorical thinking. All these barriers occurs due to these. These are the different causes actually. Wrong assumption means you assume something wrongly. Let us say the rumor. If you say why the rumors happens, because you assume something, whatever the message is being sent to you might have assumed wrongly, or you might have a different perception. Or sometimes what happens is that some people belong to a different cultural aspects, so they are having a different background aspects. So these individual barriers occurs within ourselves. It is not like the group of people when they are talking, the barrier occurs. No, it occurs because we take the things, we perceive the things in a different manner. The message might be the right, but whatever the perception, whatever the perceiveness we are doing, it is something different. That's why these barriers occurs. So these are something like an individual barrier aspects. Then comes something like organizational barriers. Organizational barriers are mostly like it forms within the organizations, and they are mostly hierarchical in structure. If you see, there is a hierarchy. Let us say there is a top level management is there, then you will be having a middle level management, then you will be having something like a low level management. And in this management, the barriers generally occurs. The major causes for the organizational barriers to occur are too many transfer stations, like you are transferred from one level to another level, or another level again you are transferring from one to another level in the within the organization. So that means what is happening is that you are transferring the many stations at a time. Then fear of superiors. So you will be having something like a fear of superior. Okay, what he will say. If I say something, what how he will perceive. So these type of fear of superiors you will be having. So it leads to something like a barrier aspect. Negative tendencies, use of inappropriate media. Let us say you want to document that thing, but you are not documenting, or you have chosen a wrong channel to send a specific information. So that leads to something like use of inappropriate media. And last one is something like information overload. A single employee is bombarded with lot of information every time, a lot of work every time. So this leads to something like an organizational barriers. Then comes something like channel barriers. So wrong choice of channel is one of the major barriers of communication. For example, you want you are using to advertise or convey a message orally, but there you want a specific written language should be there. So you want to document the document, but you are using the communication as oral approach. So it leads to something like an channel barriers. So you have to use a particular channel, a particular way, so that it should be very appropriate. The communication should follow the appropriate aspects. Another barrier is something like linguistic and cultural barriers, where the sender of the message use a different language where receiver doesn't understand. So these are mostly the cultural barriers, because if you see, the people belong to different cultures, and if you belong to a different cultures, your language barriers will be more, because you use different languages, you use different technical languages, or you use different technical jargons whenever you speak. For example, let us say that, for example, you say that the cultural barriers include something like you demonstrate a very highly technological terminologies to a normal group of people which they don't understand. So it leads to something like a barrier aspect. So whatever the communication you want to do it, you should be very generalized in nature. So linguistic and cultural barriers occurs due to more of use of more technical languages and different foreign languages which the people cannot understand. Another barrier is semantic barriers. The word semantics refers to the meaning of the words, the way in which they were used. For example, different words may have different meanings in different cultures. Failure may take into consideration that can lead to a serious blunders. Let us say if you are using a specific word having a specific meaning in a different sense, then it leads to something like a barrier aspect. That's why whenever you write in the written communication, you have to understand what type of schematics you should use. Not only in the written, let us say if you're orally been speaking up, you should avoid the jargons. If you do not avoid the jargons or very complicated language, if you speak, then what happens is that it can lead to something like a schematic barrier aspect. And the last one is something like non-verbal barriers. Non-verbal barriers means too much usage of non-verbal things. Let us say too much use of gestures at a time, or too much use of eye contacts, or your body language is very very slumped in nature. So these leads to something like a barrier. So it leads to something like a negative barrier aspects. So whatever the barriers you are being seeing, every barrier plays it hindrances actually the important message whenever the communication happens. So how you are going to overcome these barriers? The first one is always actively listen whatever the sender or the receiver is saying. Let us say if a sender is sending a message, you should actively listen what the receiver is saying. Do not deviate yourself. Try to listen very keenly so that whatever the message the sender is saying, you can able to understand exactly what he's saying. You decode that message into a small chunks. Be careful using of wordings. So always use a generalized words whenever you communicate. Do not use too much of technical jargons. If you use a lot of technical jargons or a very specific high language words, the people will not able to understand. The people will not able to cope up what exactly the message is. So this can lead to something like a rumor or something else. So avoid using this thing. So use careful wordings of the messages. Always select appropriate channel. If you want to communicate very fast, use a particular channel. For example, nowadays the people, if they want to communicate very fast a specific message, they are using a channel like WhatsApp. And these through communication through WhatsApp, whatever the message, it flows like very fast. On nowadays, if you see, a lot of social media apps are there, and these increases something like an you can say the fastness of communication. Let us say if you want to communicate very confidential matter, then your channel should be very different. Either you write us on a specific letterhead, drop it in an envelope, and then send it. So that is something like an appropriate channel selection. So always select a particular appropriate channel so that the people can able to understand the meaning of the particular, you can say the communicative aspects. Then avoid technical language. Do not include too much of technical skills, whatever you might be having, because the people are generally generalized in nature. Because if you see if you are, let us say if you are giving a presentation which includes a lot of technicalities, the audience they cannot understand. So whatever the language you should include so that you might get the approachability. For example, the best orator, if you see, is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, if you see, whenever he gives the explanation about a specific product, he uses generalized language. He never use a technical language, right? So that he can attract each person in the audience, each age group in the audience, and then provide the right feedback. Let us say if the sender is sending some messages, the receiver has to provide the feedback. If the receiver doesn't provide the feedback, it leads to barrier. That means the sender has a perception that the message might not have received. So always provide the right feedback. And if you provide the right feedback, that means your communication process is completed. Now let's see what are the various classifications of communication. So these are something like interpersonal communication, organizational communication, and mass communication. So the communication is classified into these 4 types. Let's see in detail about each type. So interpersonal communication, this type of communication generally takes place within ourselves. For example, the brain. So whatever you visualize, whatever you decode, your brain decodes that thing. So let us say if you want to speak with others, your internal dialogue comes first. You think how you should deliver that speech to others. You plan. And based on the plan, you wait what exactly the message I have to deliver. And based on that weighing, you try to consider and then process the information that how should I deliver that information to the receiver. So all these things processes generally happens in our brain. So this is something like an intrapersonal communication. Then comes something like interpersonal communication. So interpersonal communication generally happens when you share information among the people. When you share the information among a set of people, and here the few participants, very few participants are involved, which includes something like sensory channels and feedback. Here the major advantage is that the feedback is very immediate because a group you are talking to a group of people, and this interpersonal communication can be both formal as well as informal in nature. So interpersonal communication is again dependent on variety of factors, that is psychology of the two parties involved. So the psychology should be matched. It should not be such way that one person is saying something, another one is saying something. Okay, it should be properly matched. If it is not matched, then there will be a barrier. Then relationship between them, communication process, and surrounding environments. So these are the major factors. Generally, the interpersonal communication, it is heavily dependent on it. Then comes something like organizational culture. So organizational communication, it happens at the different hierarchical levels. So you see there are a lot of different hierarchical levels like top level, medium level, and low level. So in each level, the communication happens, either diagonal communication, either vertical communication, either horizontal communication or lateral communication. And the organizational communication is divided into three types, that is internal operational, external operational, and personal. Internal operational means whenever the communication you are doing within the organization, that is known as something like internal operational. External operational means whatever the communication you are doing within the organization as well as you are communicating with other one. For example, let us consider this thing. There is an automobile industry is there, right? So the automobile industry generally what happens, they used to assemble the parts, and whatever the communication they want, a specific part, they used to target a different company. So whatever the communication happens with one particular automobile industry to another small company, that is known as something like an external operations. And there is something like in personal. Personal includes mostly like whenever you communicate within a set of department in the organization. So that is mostly related to the personal aspects. And to communicate very well in the organization, you want to use something like a proper networking systems. If you don't use proper networking systems, it leads to again a barriers. And the last classification of communication is something like mass communication. If you see, this type of communication requires a mediator, either to transmit the data. The examples of mass communication are like you see it like radios, television, journals, books, newspapers. These are various examples. And the major characteristics of mass communication are they are large reach. You will have something like an impersonality. Participants are not known to each other. And everywhere you will be having a gatekeeper. For example, if you want to publish an article in the newspaper, you first have to approach to the news editor. Based on the permission given by the news editor, then only your article will be published in the newspaper. So this is something like a mass communication. So you always require a gatekeeper. And the last topic of the unit is something like importance of communication in the workplace. So if you see, these are the major importance of communication in the workplace, how generally it works. So if you are having a very good communication aspects, it increases something like greater awareness towards organizational goals and teamwork, and it builds teamwork. Because every organization, they have a specific mission and vision. And to achieve that mission and vision, you people need to communicate very effectively. So the people need to get aware. In order to get aware about these things, you people need to choose the right channels. If you choose the right channels, your teamwork will be increased. So that's why the communication is very important in the organizational level. Second one is communication betters employer-employee relationships. If you see, there are relationships which can be long-lasting. If that means you see many employees or when they communicate, when they work in the organization, if the communication is very good, either the relationships will increase or they can turn to something like a promotional levels also. So that much powerfulness the communication is aspect is. The third one is communications helps to solve problems. It helps to solve the conflicts among the people. It helps to solve the grievances raised by the people. Let us say, if, for example, if somebody is not happy with the work culture, if you communicate, if you ask them, sit them, and ask what exactly you face a problem, and if you communicate properly, it solves the problems. It improves the performance because if there is a problem solution is there, if it is having a better employee-employer relationship, if you are having a very good teamwork and your organization goals are very good, all these things, if you see this, it improved very good performance. The performance of the organization will improve, not only the performance of the organization, but as a whole of the individual, it will improve. It also brings a stronger link between the managers and the external environment. So these are the major importance communication, how the communication is important at the workplace. And if you see nowadays, this is the priority level for each and every organization. So to summarize this unit, we learned something about introduction to communication. What are the different characteristics of communication? We also learned something about modes of communication, what those modes are, like formal, informal, oral, written, verbal, and non-verbal. We learned something about the different barriers of communication, the types of noises. We also learned something about how to overcome these barriers and what are the important factors when you remember to overcome these barriers. And finally, we learned something about the classification of communication aspects and how the communication is useful in the workplace. So this summarizes the complete unit. Thank you.